Community Resilience CCR applicant webinar by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm Hadassah St. Hubert, a Senior Program Officer in the Division of Preservation and Access. I'm joined today by my colleague, Martin Sang, also Senior Program Officer in the Division of Preservation and Access. As you can see, this webinar will be recorded as well as the Q&A and also made available publicly. Please feel free to type any of your questions into the chat box, which we'll be monitoring during the presentation. Closed captioning is also available. To do this, click on the three dots at the top of your screen, then go to More Features, and then turn on Live Captions. As mentioned, this webinar will be recorded and you will receive an email with a link to the YouTube video in the next coming weeks. So thank you again for joining us on this webinar about our newest grant program, the Cultural and Community Resilience, CCR. We highly encourage you to submit drafts, which are due on Tuesday, April 11th. The application is due on Tuesday, May 16th. So today we're going to go over what the Cultural and Community Resilience Program can fund, share some of the potential examples for project ideas, and how you can apply for an award. We'll offer some suggestions for writing a good application and also have time to answer some of your questions.
The Cultural and Community Resilience, or CCR program, is administered by NEH's Division of Preservation and Access, one of 7 divisions in the offices of the NEH. CCR supports the documenting, collecting, and safeguarding of traditional knowledge, oral histories, archival materials, and other types of cultural heritage. CCR seeks to mitigate the loss of tangible or intangible cultural heritage resources in disadvantaged communities due to climate change or the COVID-19 pandemic, to sustain community in the aftermath of extreme weather events, and to otherwise advance cultural and community resilience broadly defined. The CCR program is designed to support activities such as, but not limited to, identifying and capturing cultural and historical resources, including through digital means, in communities potentially endangered by climate events such as wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, or rising sea levels, safeguarding cultural resources to mitigate the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, collecting oral histories from individuals impacted by extreme weather events or the COVID-19 pandemic, including survivors and first responders, and documenting traditional knowledge, memories of elders, practices, or technologies that may inform contemporary ways of working and living, engaging in collaborative planning efforts to prepare communities for rapid response collecting, and applying insights from cultural heritage identification and documentation projects to inform local and regional community resilience strategies. Applications should discuss the potential significance and impact of the projects to the humanities, both in terms of the individuals, communities, and collections the project would engage with, as well as the broader approach to the humanities where appropriate. CCR prioritizes projects from disadvantaged communities, and NEH welcomes applications at all stages of project development, from planning through implementation, and especially those projects that employ inclusive methodologies, such as participatory archiving, oral histories, rapid response collecting, and shared stewardship arrangements, and community-centered access and involvement. NEH also encourages you to leverage open access online resources and the use of Creative Commons licensing when possible and as appropriate. As you can see on this slide, CCR awards up to $150,000. Your project may take up to 2 years to complete, beginning as early as February the 1st, 2024. And just as a reminder that all activities must relate to climate change and/or the COVID-19 pandemic.
Since this is a new program, here are a few potential examples of project ideas that might resonate with your organization. A local historical society creates an oral history collection with reflections from first responders after wildfires or other types of climate crises. An organization is interested in documenting and safeguarding traditional memories of Indigenous elders or other knowledge keepers during the climate crises, such as drought. A community organization wishes to document the impact of climate change or a natural disaster on local agricultural production practices, the production of crafts, or the teaching of land or craft related knowledge. In an area prone to wildfires, a public library, a community college, and a local historical society develop a plan for rapid response collecting should a wildfire occur. One project outcome would be a memorandum of understanding outlining the goals of collecting and responsibilities of each partner, including for outreach to the community and for acting as the repository for physical and digital collection items. A state university stewards a post-custodial archive for a community that must resettle due to sea level rise and increased flooding. CCR would support collecting the experiences of doctors, nurses, and other emergency responders during COVID-19. It also supports the documenting of everyday community experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic, such as lifestyle changes and encounters with shortages or losses. If you have an idea, we recommend contacting us even at the very beginning stages.
Developing an application. Developing an application. When you're developing an application, please refer to the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, for all required and recommended documentation needed for submission. The main component of a CCR application is the project narrative. This is a 10-page, single-spaced document where you will describe your project, the activities you would like to undertake, and answer the questions that help address the review criteria. Organize your narrative using the section headings, which include project goals and humanities content, community participation, methodology, and outcomes. Each section aligns with one or more review criteria NEH will use to evaluate your proposal. For the project goals and humanities content section, describe the goals of your project. Address how it would mitigate the loss of tangible or intangible cultural heritage resources due to climate change or COVID-19, sustain community in the aftermath of extreme weather events, or otherwise advance cultural and community resilience. For example, how has your community felt the impacts of climate change or the coronavirus pandemic? What are the likely climate or pandemic-related risks to its cultural heritage resources? In addition, if the Justice 40 initiative identifies your community as disadvantaged under its framework, discuss the relevant circumstances, referring to the Climate and Economic Justice Screening tool available on their website. Applicants affected by the tool's deficiencies may choose to incorporate other means to describe how their community is disadvantaged. For applicants discussing the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on their community, you may refer to publicly available data provided by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention or your local jurisdiction. In the community participation section, describe how the project design will empower people and communities to define, collect, and use their cultural and historical resources. Explain how community members would participate and how you would support transparency and shared decision-making. As relevant, discuss how you would foster meaningful community engagement and partnerships, how you would address any potential harms to individuals or communities, and how you would promote continued access to and shared authority over cultural heritage. Specifically, discuss the community's role in ongoing decision-making and management of its cultural heritage. Where partnerships exist already, describe how and when they were developed, and explain how the project could enrich the broader mission and longer-term vision, goals, and capacity of each partner.
In the case of proposed projects specific to Native American groups and cultural materials, indicate how you would adhere to the NEH Code of Ethics relating to Native Americans. Within methodology, explain how you would implement the project and how your methods relate to professional practices in the humanities, preservation, and cultural heritage documentation. Discuss how your approach reflects the needs and resources of your organization or community while working to build the long-term availability and discoverability of cultural and historical resources. For oral history projects, identify narrators to the extent possible and provide examples of questions you would ask. Discuss the plans for preparatory research, recording equipment, interview settings, securing permissions, and post-interview preservation and access methods such as audio streaming transcription or time-based indexing. For guidance, refer to the Statement of Principles and Best Practices published by the Oral History Association. Describe your project's technological framework, including the software, equipment, and storage systems you will employ as relevant to your project. For example, what preservation standards and practices would you follow for the safe handling of cultural and historical resources for photographing, recording, or digitizing these items and for describing them? Identify the community's choice of a repository or repositories to hold digital copies of items within their permissions. In the outreach section, identify the project deliverables and how you would share them among key stakeholders and audiences who benefit from access. As you craft your project narrative, please be mindful of the 10-page application limit. You may describe how you would address intellectual property and privacy issues and provide documentation of existing or sample permissions, donor agreements, licenses, or proofs of informed consent as relevant, within additional supporting documentation. For planning and pilot projects, discuss your likely next steps. For implementation projects, describe how you would sustain the resulting resources. Please note, you should budget for 2 members of your project team to attend a 2-day meeting in Washington, D.C. in May 2025. We'll be convening the project directors for this program.
In addition to the project narrative, we ask you to include some supporting information to bolster your case for funding. All applicants should submit a budget and budget justification, a written explanation of the line items listed in your budget. Another requirement is the inclusion of a detailed work plan where you outline the specific steps to achieving your project's goals. You may want to format this as a bulleted list or a table. A monthly or quarterly breakdown is often a helpful level of detail, and you may also want to make note of who's working on which part of the project. Also, don't forget to build in a little padding time. If reasonable for your project, we recommend requesting the full 2 years allowed. Finally, all applicants must include resumes or CVs for the staff and consultants participating in the project. We recommend including a letter of commitment and/or a letter of support from communities or organizations you intend to work with. While not required, other supporting documents, including examples of questions you will ask or conversation prompts for oral history projects, are also encouraged. For more tips on what constitutes a good proposal and to understand the application process in general, please read the post Tips on Applying for a Preservation and Access Award at the top of our blog on the NEH Division of Preservation and Access website.
We'll also make sure to make these links available in the chat section. Here are some other suggestions that might be useful as you're thinking about applying to the NEH. Read the Notice of Funding Opportunity or Guidelines on the website. I highly suggest to read and reread the grant application instructions before, during, and after the writing of your proposal. Please feel free to contact us at any point. We can answer any questions before your submission. Draft early and solicit feedback. Make sure to fully address the review criteria. Submitted drafts also can be short and in early stages of development. Include all information specified in the guidelines. Link the project to its potential impact and importance to the field of the humanities. Include strong letters of support when permitted. And proofread. Always get another set of eyes to read your application prior to submission.
As we encourage you to submit drafts and applications, you should also know what the application review process looks like. There are 4 levels of review. At the first level is the peer review, a panel review by peers. Applications are sorted into panels with regard to institution or collection type. The peer reviewers will evaluate the applications based on the review criteria mentioned previously. They then assign a rating to each proposal and submit written comments. Second, the applications are reviewed by NEH staff and recommendations are made. Following that, the National Council on the Humanities, an advisory board comprised of 26 members who have distinguished themselves in the humanities, meets 3 times a year to advise. Advisory board members are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The Council discuss the applications and make their recommendations for funding to the Chair of the Endowment. Finally, the NEH Chair makes the final funding decisions.
Program officers, such as myself and Martin on this webinar, can help you navigate through the grant process from pre-application to the final report. We can help you determine the right funding program for your project and offer advice on preparing proposals. We appreciate this chance to speak with you early in the process and also to clarify any questions that you may have.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your questions and comments. If others come to mind that you wish to discuss a potential application after this webinar, please reach out to us at preservation@neh.gov for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
So I'm just going to read the questions in the chat. And the first one is, are the supporting documents part of the 10-page limit? No, they are not. These are just additional. So let me just go over the kind of page limits that we specifically need for like the narrative. So it's just the narrative itself that is a minimum of 10, well, maximum of 10 pages. For resumes, we recommend 2 pages per personnel. And will this grant be offered in 2024? Yes, it will, and it will be on the May deadline instead of, we previously had it in January, but moving forward, it will be offered every year in May as the deadline. And Martin, I'll read out this question for you. Would the safeguarding of pre-existing collections at risk due to climate change be an eligible project? Or does there need to be an element of active gathering and documentation of artifacts, stories, etc.?
It would be eligible, and I would make a strong case within the project narrative to talk about those impacts and challenges of climate change, or if it's to do with the pandemic as well. This grant does actively seek oral histories and other documentation, but that's not necessarily a need within an application.
The next question, for the draft submission on April 11th, this is just the draft narrative section or all attachments. We take them as you are ready. If you are ready with a full narrative, budget, attachments, we can review those as well. If you are only preparing one section of the narrative, we also review those as well.
And just a couple more points on that we do recommend submitting drafts at all stages. We look at the content and one can advise on the topic at hand. So please don't feel pressured if you don't think it's worthy of other eyes or in the stages that you're crafting it. It's often useful to have a conversation with one of us, and you can reach us primarily by email, but we can also set up a telephone or a Teams call with you to discuss through various aspects of the project.
The next question, Martin, which I think you'll like, is can the protection of sacred areas be a part of what will be funded?
It's an excellent question. We take an inclusive approach to the funding narrative that is included in that. So within the sacred narrative part of a grant procedure, definitely speak to and about the community that is engaged within the protection of the assets and what you consider those to be within the realm of the humanities as well. So tying it back to the land or to the community practices, the traditional knowledge, for example, will help bring a stronger proposal to the table for you. And we can obviously advise you in the early stages of who to contact, perhaps, what types of authorities or community elders or stakeholders that you should solicit within your application.
For projects that include university staff, is there a recommended mandated percentage of their time to include in the budget? I would say budget the amount of time needed to complete the project. We don't have an exact recommendation there. I would check that with any other federal awards, of course, that you're with. If someone is budgeted for 100% of their time on one federal award and also 100% another federal award, that wouldn't be allowed. And so that's the only caveat I have there, but budget for the amount of time that you need to complete the project. And that also means in terms of their pay, specifically making sure that, our peer reviewers are going to look for, are people being paid adequately for the amount of work that is being requested.
And that also extends to community participants as well. So if you are considering oral histories or podcasts or interviews, audiovisual, filming, recording, paying people for their time should be well budgeted and their participation too.
Next question is this a project school age students could do? And so I would say there, as long as the emphasis is on humanities content, so we need a little bit more specifics on what the school age students would be doing. And of course, whatever permissions are required to work with school age children. So I need to know a little bit more about what project this is before I kind of answer a little bit more in depth. So please feel to add a little bit more in the chat and we'll circle back to it. Would filmed first-person interviews as part of the source material be considered under the same guidelines as the oral history documentation?
Absolutely. And as you see, we've been emphasizing community-centeredness. So we would also suggest that a project speaks to the community and agrees with the community what are the best methods and ways of documenting. So if that is by filming first-person interviews, then so be it.
Could you provide specific examples of how you would like content archived and made available to the public? And so what I would say there, we don't have specific recommendations. This is based on your particular community. If certain aspects are supposed to be made public, we welcome that. If certain aspects you want to be held a little bit more private, just for certain access for community members, certain access level to the public, that is fine as well. But you just need to provide explanations about why are you choosing to go through those particular methods, and once again, in respect of the community that you'd be working with. As far as content being archived, do you have any other recommendations, Martin?
In general, to have it in several distinct places, co-sharing or co-governance of materials, collaborating on having materials, be they documentation, available in many places so that they can be accessed by different types of publics and communities would be a great opportunity for this grant. So it will also allow hopefully some applicants to work with smaller organizations that have limited capacity, and that they can also perhaps archive pieces of the grant that makes of the materials that result from the grant that makes sense. And so sort of shared ownership and co-ownership of materials would also be encouraged in those circumstances, and in different formats as well. So it might be a case that a percentage or a piece of the materials be available online, and a case made for that, and also a case made not for all of the materials be available in one format. So a mixed methods approach might also work for you.
Are there any budgetary limits on equipment? I believe here you might mean supplies and materials, but feel free to correct me. So by supplies and materials, I'm meaning like cameras, recorders, computers, laptops of those sorts. So there's no limits on supplies and materials. As far as equipment, if you mean equipment, that would be $5,000 or more in terms of cost, but I believe here you mean materials and supplies like related to oral history documentation. If you don't, let me know, I'll circle back. For the oral history projects, would a nonprofit applicant that is not a collecting institution need to partner with a collecting institution as custodians of the oral histories?
That's a great question. So the purposes of the grant isn't to for a long-term custodial project as much as we would like that. And I'm looking also to Hadassah for you to weigh in on this. Of course, long-term preservation and availability would be welcomed and useful. But what makes most sense for these materials for the community and the circumstance, it should be first addressed within the project narrative, and an argument based around that. So it would not, I would say, prevent a small organization without access to a larger repository at an recognized academic institution by no means. But perhaps there are ways of working towards an understanding, or for this to be a stepping stone, sort of an a foundations or a prospective grant to opening up those doors for that piece as well in a future round of funding or other grant opportunity.
I would add, at least on your project team, also think to add maybe someone who does have that kind of experience, because we do want to think about if you're collecting these oral histories, what are you doing long term for their preservation? So if you, whether it's recruiting a consultant or working and partnering, so that way another institution becomes the custodian, just make sure you have those permissions in mind, and also that it's in line with what your community sees as potential access or pathways to access as well. Would a historical house that is also a museum in the need of preservation services qualify? The climate-related aspect that needs to be updated is the air system to mitigate further damage, as the house was built in 1889. We'd actually recommend our Sustaining Cultural Heritage Collections program instead. So this actually deals with any climate and environmental impacts on your building. So CCR is more about the kind of cultural resources in the building. The building itself would qualify for our sustaining cultural heritage collections, and we'll make sure to add that link to the chat. Do we need to know all of our organization partners already, or can we give examples to say that we intend to seek similar organizations?
I would suggest that as far as you can, to identify all partners, to approach them as well, and to discuss the grant opportunity, and to perhaps go forward with the project narrative with their voice and inclusion included. Should there be a category within within the grant where the person isn't named, I believe they can come on as a consultant later on in the grant if not named.
Is program evaluation study of an organization's efforts towards building a community's resilience towards COVID, climate change applicable?
I think we would need a little bit more information on that, what is involved in the evaluation, and how the CCR grant would support that initiative and what would come out of the piece of the grant. So Jen, if by your name on here, you're very welcome to reach out to Hadassah and myself after that for a discussion. But again, we try to be as inclusive within the sort of remit of the CCR grant offering.
And also, I would emphasize too that at least for project activities, thinking about what does that resilience look like? Is there, the documenting the oral histories, like the project activity does have to be focused on some kind of documentation of sorts. And so an evaluation could be part of it, but I would say the focus on the documentation of the community and their experiences with COVID or climate change to be at the forefront. I have a feature film project that is filming in a national swamp park. Part of our plan is to partner with the park to preserve the land against miners looking to destroy the biodiversity of the ecosystem. If the film brings awareness to this issue, would this be eligible for funding? So I would, once again, I'm going back to suggesting to the documenting and collecting of these kind of intangible or tangible histories. A film could be also an outcome or a product as well to kind of bring awareness to the issue. So yes, it is an eligible funding activity, but once again, the focus has to be on the documenting and collecting or the preservation of a collection.
I'm sorry, Hadassah. We could think of the feature film as a sort of finished project that is made up of smaller pieces, such as interviews, documentation, archival resources that really speak to some of the importance of the CCR grant and climate change and land use, environmental impact. So if you perhaps think about those individual pieces within the aspects of this grant, that might be a very interesting proposal.
Community-wide murals reflecting cultural resilience. I'm guessing you mean the preservation of the murals themselves. I'm guessing she wants to know if this would be an eligible activity. Once again, the kind of, if perhaps you want to include the people who did the murals, some oral history interviews, their influences on why they were inspired to create the mural, maybe some views of other community members and what they think of the mural. So making the project once again focused on the documenting and collecting of the cultural history of the mural itself. I don't know, Martin, if you have anything else to add there.
Great. No, this is a really wonderful point, is that murals are an important tangible project and product of cultural and community resilience. So approaching it, as Hadassah says, from that angle of how do these murals come about? What does it mean to the community? What is the practice? So it's not just as I'm reading it, it's not as you are proposing. It's obviously not from the art perspective, but from the humanities-centered approach, which I think is commendable. So to sort of to mold and fashion the proposal, the project within the community, and what does mural and mural making mean, and how does that come about, would be worthwhile pursuing, I think.
Okay, regarding climate change, pandemic impact requirements, with the closing of institutions during the height of the pandemic, does reopening and implementing a new process that includes technology to preserve collections and how program services are delivered? I'm guessing they're asking if this is ineligible.
Yes. Again, I think a consultation with Hadassah Roy on how to bring forward the humanities aspect of that. You know, if it's a case of how do people feel, what was happening in the community and for users and stakeholders, rather than a change from one process to the other, I think would be helpful here. I'm sorry that that's not a more direct answer, but speaking about the pandemic and cultural institutions, I think there is something there to discuss with us.
I represent a history museum. Would it be acceptable to include collection software in the budget so we can share out the oral histories to the public with permissions, of course? Yes, this would be a fine eligible cost. And that was much simpler. um, just going to scroll down. Okay, so for clarity on that equipment budget question, we're working with the subrecipient that has purchase needs that are more than the $5,000 for specialty scanners. So for this, I might have to tap on our Deputy Director, Margaret Walker-Clare. We'll guide you a little bit more there with our Office of Grants Management for kind of clarity, a little bit more on the equipment question because I'm kind of wondering why that scanner for $5,000. Would it be better for a kind of camera type of setup? So, those are the kinds of things to potentially evaluate. And it seems like you're going to be working with another partner, but is it the total of everything that's more $5,000, or it's just like separate pieces altogether that total $5,000? Otherwise, that would go into the materials and supplies that I mentioned. But Brittany, please make sure to email us and we can actually arrange a consult with you and we can speak a little bit further about equipment needs and also just matching the scope of the project that you like to work on. So it looks like I got to, okay, great.
So I was
I
just
got
about
to
to,
most of the
I was,
questions, but
I'd just like to say on that last question, Brittany, if, for example, or to anybody that's listening, if an application comes in with such a question about such an object or an item that sort of stands out, that won't be a deal breaker for the entire project or for us to consider it. We would work with our offices to understand both that item and in the context. So please don't think about or be afraid to submit something thinking that would sort of negate the entire project. We would work with you on that.
well, thank you all. I'm just gonna issue a call for any additional questions, comments, even potential project ideas you want to run by us. That's fine. We do have actually quite a bit of time, but thank you all for joining us. If you don't have any questions at mind at the moment, you can feel free to email us at preservation@neh.gov, and we can set up a consult call to speak a little bit more in detail about your projects. Martin and I especially love speaking about different projects, and we can, of course, guide you along the way.